Welcome friends. Colonialism in the countryside. In this chapter you will see what colonial rule meant to those who lived in the countryside. You will meet the zamindars of Bengal, travel to the Raj Mahal hills where the Pahariyas and the Santals lived, and then move west to the Deccan. You will look at the way the English East India Company, EIC, established its Raj in the countryside, implemented its revenue policies, what these policies meant to different sections of people, and how they changed everyday lives. Laws introduced by the state have consequences for people. They determine to an extent who grows richer and who poorer, who acquires new land and who loses the land they have lived on, where peasants go when they need money. As you will see, however, people were not only subject to the working of laws, they also resisted the law by acting according to what they believed to be just. In doing so, people defined the way in which laws operated, thereby modifying their consequences. You will also come to know about the sources that tell us about these histories, and the problems historians face in interpreting them. You will read about revenue records and surveys, journals and accounts left by surveyors, and travelers, and reports produced by inquiry commissions. Bengal and the Jamindars. As you know, colonial rule was first established in Bengal. It is here that the earliest attempts were made to reorder rural society and establish a new regime of land rights and a new revenue system. Let us see what happened in Bengal in the early years of Company, EIC, rule. 1.1. An auction in Burdwan. In 1797 there was an auction in Burdwan, present-day Bardhaman. It was a big public event. A number of mahals, estates, held by the Raja of Burdwan were being sold. The permanent settlement had come into operation in 1793. The East India Company had fixed the revenue that each zamindar had to pay. The estates of those who failed to pay were to be auctioned to recover the revenue. Since the Raja had accumulated huge arrears, his estates had been put up for auction. Numerous purchases came to the auction and the estates were sold to the highest bidder. But the collector soon discovered a strange twist to the tale. Many of the purchases turned out to be servants and agents of the Raja who had bought the lands on behalf of their master. Over 95% of the sale at the auction was fictitious. The Raja's estates had been publicly sold, but he remained in control of his zamindari. Solve the following questions. Why had the Raja failed to pay the revenue? Who were the purchasers at the auction? What does the story tell us about what was happening in the rural areas of eastern India at that time? 1.2. The problem of unpaid revenue. The estates of the Burdwan Raj were not the only ones sold during the closing years of the 18th century. Over 75% of the zamindaries changed hands after the permanent settlement. In introducing the permanent settlement, British officials hoped to resolve the problems they had been facing since the conquest of Bengal. By the 1770s, the rural economy in Bengal was in crisis, with recurrent famines and declining agricultural output. Officials felt that agriculture, trade and the revenue resources of the state could all be developed by encouraging investment in agriculture. This could be done by securing rights of property and permanently fixing the rates of revenue demand. If the revenue demand of the state was permanently fixed, then the company could look forward to a regular flow of revenue, while entrepreneurs could feel sure of earning a profit from their investment, since the state would not siphon it off by increasing its claim. The process, officials hoped, would lead to the emergence of a class of yeoman farmers and rich landowners who would have the capital and enterprise to improve agriculture. Nurtured by the British, this class would also be loyal to the company. The problem, however, lay in identifying individuals who could both improve agriculture and contract to pay the fixed revenue to the state. After a prolonged debate amongst company officials, the permanent settlement was made with the Rajas and Talukdars of Bengal. They were now classified as zamindars, and they had to pay the revenue demand that was fixed in perpetuity. In terms of this definition, the zamindar was not a landowner in the village, but a revenue collector of the state. Zamindars had several, sometimes as many as 400, villagers under them. In company calculations, the villages within one zamindari formed one revenue estate. The company fixed the total demand over the entire estate whose revenue the zamindar contracted to pay. The zamindar collected rent from the different villages, paid the revenue to the company, and retained the difference as his income. He was expected to pay the company regularly, failing which his estate could be auctioned. 1.3. Why zamindars defaulted on payments. Company officials felt that a fixed revenue demand would give zamindars a sense of security and, assured of returns on their investment, encouraged them to improve their estates. In the early decades after the permanent settlement, however, zamindars regularly failed to pay the revenue demand and unpaid balances accumulated. The reasons for this failure were various. First, the initial demands were very high. This was because it was felt that if the demand was fixed for all time to come, the company would never be able to claim a share of increased income from land when prices rose and cultivation expanded. To minimize this anticipated loss, the company pegged the revenue demand high, arguing that the burden on zamindars would gradually decline as agricultural production expanded and prices rose. Second, this high demand was imposed in the 1790s, a time when the prices of agricultural produce were depressed, making it difficult for the ryots to pay their dues to the zamindar. If the zamindar could not collect the rent, how could he pay the company? Third, the revenue was invariable, regardless of the harvest, and had to be paid punctually. In fact, according to the sunset law, if payment did not come in by sunset of the specified date, the zamindari was liable to be auctioned. Fourth, the permanent settlement initially limited the power of the zamindar to collect rent from the ryot and manage his zamindari. The company had recognized the zamindars as important, but it wanted to control and regulate them, subdue their authority and restrict their autonomy. The zamindar's troops were disbanded, customs duties abolished, and their kacharis, courts, brought under the supervision of a collector appointed by the company. Zamindars lost their power to organize local justice and the local police. Over time, the collectorate emerged as an alternative center of authority, severely restricting what the zamindar could do. In one case, when a raja failed to pay the revenue, a company official was speedily dispatched to his zamindari with explicit instructions to take charge of the district and to use the most effectual means to destroy all the influence and the authority the raja and his officers. At the time of rent collection, an officer of the zamindar, usually the amla, came around to the village. But rent collection was a perennial problem. Sometimes bad harvests and low prices made payment of dues difficult for the ryots. At other times, ryots deliberately delayed payment. Rich ryots and village headmen jotedars and mandals were only too happy to see the zamindar in trouble. The zamindar could therefore not casually assert his power over them. Zamindars could prosecute defaulters, but the judicial process was long drawn. In Burdwan alone there were over 30,000 pending suits for arrears of rent payment in 1798. 1.4. The rise of the jotdars. While many zamindars were facing a crisis at the end of the 18th century, a group of rich peasants were consolidating their position in the villages. In Francis Buchanan's survey of the Dinajpur district in North Bengal, we have a vivid description of this class of rich peasants known as jotedars. By the early 19th century, jotedars had acquired vast areas of land, sometimes as much as several thousand acres. They controlled local trade as well as money lending, exercising immense power over the poorer cultivators of the region. A large part of their land was cultivated through sharecroppers, adhirs or bargadas, who brought their own plows, labored in the field, and handed over half the produce to the jotedars after the harvest. Within the villages, the power of jotedars was more effective than that of zamindars. Unlike zamindars who often lived in urban areas, jotedars were located in the villages and exercised direct control over a considerable section of poor villages. They fiercely resisted efforts by zamindars to increase the jama of the village, prevented zamindari officials from executing their duties, mobilized riots who were dependent on them, and deliberately delayed payments of revenue to the zamindar. In fact, when the estates of the zamindars were auctioned for failure to make revenue payment, jotedars were often amongst the purchasers. The jotedars were most powerful in North Bengal, although rich peasants and village headmen were emerging as commanding figures in the countryside in other parts of Bengal as well. In some places they were called holadas, elsewhere they were known as gantidas or mandals. Their rise inevitably weakened zamindari authority. 1.5. The zamindars resist the authority of the zamindars in rural areas, however, did not collapse. Faced with an exorbitantly high revenue demand and possible auction of their estates, they devised ways of surviving the pressures. New contexts produced new strategies. Fictitious sale was one such strategy. It involved a series of maneuvers. The Raja of Burdwan, for instance, first transferred some of his zamindari to his mother, since the company had decreed that the property of women would not be taken over. Then, as a second move, his agents manipulated the auctions. The revenue demand of the company was deliberately withheld, and unpaid balances were allowed to accumulate. When a part of the estate was auctioned, the zamindar's men bought the property, outbidding other purchasers. Subsequently, they refused to pay up the purchase money, so that the estate had to be resold. Once again it was bought by the zamindar's agents, once again the purchase money was not paid, and once again there was an auction. This process was repeated endlessly, exhausting the state, and the other bidders at the auction. At last the estate was sold at a low price back to the zamindar. The zamindar never paid the full revenue demand. The company rarely recovered the unpaid balances that had piled up. Such transactions happened on a grand scale. Between 1793 and 1814, big zamindaries of Bengal, including Burdwan, made Benami purchases that collectively yielded as much as 30 lakh rupees. Of the total sales at the auctions, over 15% were fictitious. There were other ways in which zamindars circumvented displacement. When people from outside the zamindari bought an estate at an auction, they could not always take possession. At times their agents would be attacked by lutyals of the former zamindar. Sometimes even the riots resisted the entry of outsiders. They felt bound to their own zamindar through a sense of loyalty and perceived him as a figure of authority and themselves as his proja, subjects. The sale of the zamindari disturbed their sense of identity, their pride. The zamindars therefore were not easily displaced. By the beginning of the 19th century the depression in prices was over. Thus those who had survived the troubles of the 1790s consolidated their power. Rules of revenue payment were also made somewhat flexible. As a result, the zamindar's power over the villagers was strengthened. It was only during the Great Depression of the 1930s that they finally collapsed and the jotedars consolidated their power in the countryside. 1.6. The fifth report. Many of the changes we are discussing were documented in detail in a report that was submitted to the British Parliament in 1813. It was the fifth of a series of reports on the administration and activities of the East India Company in India. Often referred to as the fifth report, it ran into 1002 pages, of which over 800 pages were appendices that reproduced petitions of zamindars and riots, reports of collectors from different districts, statistical tables on revenue returns, and notes on the revenue and judicial administration of Bengal and Madras, present-day Tamil Nadu, written by officials. From the time the company established its rule in Bengal in the mid-1760s, its activities were closely watched and debated in England. There were many groups in Britain who were opposed to the monopoly that the East India Company had over trade with India and China. These groups wanted a revocation of the royal charter that gave the company this monopoly. An increasing number of private traders wanted a share in the India trade, and the industrialists of Britain were keen to open up the Indian market for British manufactures. Many political groups argued that the conquest of Bengal was benefiting only the East India Company but not the British nation as a whole. Information about company misrule and maladministration was hotly debated in Britain, and incidents of the greed and corruption of company officials were widely publicized in the press. The British Parliament passed a series of acts in the late 18th century to regulate and control company rule in India. It forced the company to produce regular reports on the administration of India and appointed committees to inquire into the affairs of the company. The fifth report was one such report produced by a select committee. It became the basis of intense parliamentary debates on the nature of the East India Company's rule in India. For over a century and a half, the fifth report has shaped our conception of what happened in rural Bengal in the late 18th century. The evidence contained in the fifth report is invaluable. But official reports like this have to be read carefully. We need to know who wrote the reports and why they were written. In fact, recent researches show that the arguments and evidence offered by the fifth report cannot be accepted uncritically. Researchers have carefully examined the archives of various Bengal zamindars and the local records of the districts to write about the history of colonial rule in rural Bengal. They indicate that, intent on criticizing the maladministration of the company, the fifth report exaggerated the collapse of traditional zamindari power, as also overestimated the scale on which zamindars were losing their land. As we have seen, even when zamindaris were auctioned, zamindars were not always displaced, given the ingenious methods they used to retain their zamindaris.